It started as a simple walk. I wasn't looking for anything, just some fresh air and a break from the monotony of life. The town where I'd recently moved was quiet, too quiet, so I often found myself wandering its outskirts, exploring the forgotten corners where civilization blurred into wilderness. That's how I found the park. The forest path opened suddenly into a clearing, and there it was, an abandoned playground, nestled in a hollow as though the earth itself was trying to hide it. At first glance, it seemed like any other forgotten relic, a relic of childhood left to decay. Rusted swings hung motionless from creaking chains, their seats worn and frayed. A merry-go-round tilted at an awkward angle, its paint chipped and peeling. The slide, once bright and inviting, was now a dull gray, streaked with grime. But it wasn't the state of the park that caught my attention. It was the sign at the entrance. The wooden board was large and weathered, the paint cracked and faded, yet the words carved into its surface were still clear, as though they had been etched with purpose. Rules of the park. Do not enter after sunset. If you hear laughter, do not seek its source. Never approach the carousel. Do not use the swings or any other equipment. If anything moves, leave immediately. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I read the rules. They weren't phrased like typical warnings. There was no mention of safety hazards or unstable structures. These rules felt different. They didn't ask for caution. They demanded it. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out and laugh at me for taking it seriously. But the clearing was empty. The only sound, the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. The park seemed almost to hold its breath, waiting. A part of me wanted to leave, to turn back and forget I'd ever seen the place. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and against my better judgment, I stepped through the warped wooden gate. The ground crunched beneath my feet as I walked past the swing set. One of the swings swayed slightly, though there was no wind. I stopped and stared at it, feeling a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. It was probably just a loose choin, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The carousel loomed at the center of the park, its chipped horses frozen mid-gallop. The paint on their faces had faded, leaving their hollow eyes and gaping mouths to stare out at the empty clearing. I avoided looking at it for too long. I wandered deeper, weaving between the broken equipment. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The rules lingered in my mind, each one etched there as though I'd read them 100 times. Why would anyone need rules like that for a playground? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I caught myself glancing toward the exit more often. Something about the light seemed off, the shadows stretching too far, too fast. A chill ran through me as I checked my watch. 5:43 p.m. Sunset wasn't far off. I turned back toward the gate, my footsteps hurried now. The park had been intriguing during the day, but the thought of being here after dark made my chest tighten. I reached the edge of the clearing and hesitated, glancing back once. The swing I had passed earlier was still swaying. Harder now. I didn't wait to see what moved it. The park stayed with me. Even after I returned home, its image lingered in my mind. The eerie stillness, the rusted swings, and especially that sign. The rules weren't just strange. They felt alive, almost like a warning meant for me specifically. I told myself it was just an old, abandoned playground, nothing more. Yet the unease wouldn't fade. That night, I dreamed of the carousel, its chipped horses spinning slowly in the dark. There was no music, just the faint sound of chains rattling and a distant, childlike laugh. The next morning, I convinced myself to go back. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, an itch I needed to scratch. The park had left questions, and I wanted answers. Armed with a flashlight, my phone, and a notebook, I made my way back down the forest trail. The sunlight filtering through the trees felt weaker than the day before. and the air carried an unfamiliar chill. When I stepped into the clearing, it was as though the park had been waiting for me. Everything was just as I'd left it. The swings hung still, the slide gleamed faintly in the pale light, and the carousel loomed in the center, motionless but menacing. I walked cautiously, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The silence was heavier this time, as if the clearing was holding its breath. The wind stirred, and one of the swings creaked softly. I froze, staring at it. It didn't move again, but the sound lingered in my ears. I approached the carousel, keeping a wide berth. The chipped horses looked even worse in the daylight, their hollow eyes seeming to follow me. Around the base, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Faint marks in the dirt. They weren't footprints exactly, more like trails, as though something had been dragged around the edge. The air grew colder as I knelt to examine the marks. They led away from the carousel, disappearing into the tall grass at the edge of the park. My heart pounded as I debated whether to follow them. The second rule came to mind. If you hear laughter, do not seek its source. The thought made me shiver. I stood quickly, brushing the dirt off my hands. As I turned back toward the center of the park, I heard it. A soft laugh, high-pitched and echoing as if carried on the wind. It came from somewhere near the swings. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Every instinct told me to leave, to run. Instead, I stayed rooted, scanning the clearing for any sign of movement. There was nothing. No children, no animals, no sign of life. Just that laugh, drifting through the still air. My gaze flicked to the swings. One of them was swaying gently, the chain creaking with each slow arc. There was no wind. I backed away slowly, my footsteps careful and deliberate. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving the park deathly silent. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned and walked toward the gate. I didn't run, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to. As I stepped through the gate and back into the forest, the air seemed to ease. The oppressive weight of the park lifted slightly, though the unease in my chest didn't fade. I glanced back once, just for a moment. The carousel had shifted. I couldn't stay away. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd seen enough. But something about that park pulled at me like a thread I couldn't stop unraveling. The laughter, the moving swing, the carousel, none of it made sense, and that lack of sense only deepened my obsession. On the third day, I returned in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping low in the sky. The clearing felt different this time, heavier, darker. The shadows stretched long across the gravel path, and the air was colder than it should have been. As I stepped through the gate, I felt the weight of the park settle over me, pressing against my skin like an invisible force. I walked toward the carousel, drawn to it, despite every warning in my gut. The horses stared blankly ahead, their chipped paint and hollow eyes as lifeless as ever. Yet something about it seemed alive. I circled it carefully, my flashlight ready, though the sun hadn't yet set. That's when I noticed the tracks again. They were more defined now, looping around the base of the carousel in wide, uneven arcs. Whatever had made them was heavy enough to compress the dirt, leaving deep grooves in the ground. My eyes followed the tracks to their starting point, a patch of grass at the edge of the clearing where the ground was torn and disturbed. Kneeling, I brushed away the dirt and found a small broken toy, a plastic soldier, its limbs melted and misshapen. The sight of it sent a shiver through me. I wasn't sure why, but it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong here. I pocketed the toy and stood, turning back toward the swings. That's when I heard it again. The laughter. This time, it was closer. The sound sent a chill racing up my spine. It wasn't just laughter, it was layered, overlapping, as though multiple voices were giggling at once. It echoed faintly across the clearing, coming from every direction and nowhere at all. Rule 2 flashed in my mind. If you hear laughter, do not seek its source. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my feet refused to move. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, each note drilling into my ears like a mocking chant. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. My eyes darted around the park, searching for movement, but everything was still. Too still. Even the swings were motionless now, their chains hanging limp in the air. I took a step back, and that's when I saw it. Footprints in the dirt. Small, childlike footprints, leading from the carousel to the swings. They weren't there before. My chest tightened as I followed the trail with my eyes, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints stopped in front of the swing set, but the grass there was flattened, as though someone, or something, was sitting there. My hands trembled as I backed away, the rules flashing in my mind like a mantra. Do not enter after sunset. If you hear laughter, do not seek its source. Never approach the carousel. If anything moves, leave immediately. The carousel creaked behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The horses had shifted, slightly, but undeniably. Their heads were tilted toward me now, their hollow eyes boring into mine. The carousel groaned again, the sound low and guttural, like a living thing awakening from a long slumber. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted toward the gate, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled onto the forest path. The laughter started again as I ran, echoing faintly behind me. This time, it followed me all the way home. That night, I locked every door and window, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rules weren't just warnings, they were protection, and I had barely followed them. The rules haunted me, their words seared into my brain. I couldn't forget them even if I tried. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the swing set, the carousel, and those small footprints in the dirt. The laughter followed me into my dreams, always distant, always echoing. I should have stayed away. I knew that. But some part of me, some reckless, insatiable part, needed answers. I convinced myself it was for closure, that if I faced the park one last time, I could let it go. But deep down, I knew I was walking into something I didn't understand. This time, I came prepared. A flashlight, a heavy wrench tucked into my jacket, and a notebook to document anything I found. I waited until just after sunset. The forest bathed in the fading glow of twilight. By the time I reached the clearing, darkness had settled fully over the park. The gate groaned as I pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The park looked the same, yet different. The air was colder, thicker, carrying a faint metallic tang. The shadows cast by the broken equipment seemed darker, deeper, as if they stretched toward me. The rules came back to me as I stepped inside. Do not enter after sunset. If you hear laughter, do not seek its source. Never approach the carousel. Do not use the swings or any other equipment. If anything moves, leave immediately. I had already broken the first rule. My flashlight's beam swept across the clearing, landing on the swing set. The chains hung still, but my skin prickled as I remembered how they had moved before. The laughter hadn't started yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. I avoided the carousel, keeping to the edge of the park. My goal was to find anything that could explain what was happening. Clues, traces, anything that could bring logic to the chaos. My flashlight flickered as I passed the slide, its rusted surface gleaming faintly in the pale light. Then I heard it. A soft crack, like metal shifting under weight. My flashlight darted toward the sound, landing on the merry-go-round. It was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, The chipped and faded platform spun in a lazy circle, the horses bobbing up and down in jerky motions. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. Rule 3. Never approach the carousel. The air grew colder as I watched it turn, the motion hypnotic and wrong. The horses' hollow eyes seemed to follow me, their chipped faces frozen in distorted expressions. A low hum filled the air, almost like distant music, and then came the laughter. It was louder this time, closer, surrounding me from every direction. I spun, the flashlight shaking in my hands as I tried to locate the source. There was nothing, no movement, no figures, just the laughter echoing across the clearing. My gaze flicked to the swings. One of them was swaying gently, its chains creaking in time with the laughter. My stomach churned as I stepped back, the rules screaming in my mind. If anything moves, leave immediately. But the gate was so far away, the darkness between me and the exit feeling impossibly vast. My legs refused to move, fear rooting me in place. The carousel groaned louder, its speed increasing as the laughter reached a fever pitch. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, small, childlike, but wrong. It stood near the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, its head tilted unnaturally, the shape of its body distorted as though it didn't belong in this world. I blinked, and it was closer. A chill raced down my spine as I realized it wasn't walking. It was sliding, its movements jerky and stilted. The flashlight flickered again, plunging me into brief darkness. When the light returned, the figure was gone, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, echoing in my ears like a taunt. I ran. My feet pounded against the dirt as I bolted for the gate, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. Behind me, the laughter turned into a high-pitched wail, a sound so piercing it felt like my skull would crack. The merry-go-rounds, spinning, grew frantic, its metal parts groaning under the strain. I didn't stop until I was through the gate, slamming it shut behind me. The laughter cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the rustle of the forest. My hands shook as I turned back toward the clearing. The park was silent, the carousel motionless, the swings hanging still. But in the faint light of the flashlight, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the gravel path leading to the gate were footprints. Small, childlike footprints, stopping just a few feet from where I stood. I wasn't sure if they were following me or waiting. I spent the next day trying to convince myself it was over, that I had escaped the park and whatever was inside it. But the small, childlike footprints lingered in my mind. They had stopped just short of the gate, as though whatever made them knew exactly where I'd gone. The laughter, the carousel, the figure, it all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. By nightfall, I realized I couldn't ignore it. I had to go back, not because I wanted to, but because I felt like I had no choice. The park wasn't done with me, and I couldn't live with the uncertainty of what might happen if I ignored it. I returned just after sunset. The forest was darker this time, the air colder. My flashlight flickered as I approached the gate, the beam barely cutting through the thick shadows that seemed to pulse around the park. My breath fogged in the air as I stepped inside. The rules burned in my mind, their words etched into my thoughts. Do not enter after sunset. If you hear laughter, do not seek its source. Never approach the carousel. Do not use the swings or any other equipment. If anything moves, leave immediately. I had already broken the first rule, and I knew the others were likely to follow. The park felt different tonight, more alive, more aware. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of rusted metal. The swings were still, their chains gleaming faintly in the weak light of my flashlight. The carousel loomed in the center of the clearing, its chipped horses frozen mid-gallop. The sight of it sent a chill through me. It looked too still, like it was waiting. Then the laughter started. Soft at first, like a distant echo, but it grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't coming from one direction this time. It surrounded me, pressing in from every side. My flashlight jerked toward the swings, which now moved slowly, their chains creaking in rhythm with the laughter. Rule 4. Do not use the swings or any other equipment. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed away, my eyes scanning the clearing. The laughter grew sharper, higher pitched, almost taunting, and then I saw it. The figure, standing by the carousel. It was small, childlike, but wrong in every way. Its body was thin and angular, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Shadows clung to it, obscuring its features, but its eyes, dark, hollow pits, shone faintly in the dim light. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. The carousel groaned, its platform creaking as it began to spin. Slowly at first, then faster, the chipped horses bobbing up and down in jerky, unnatural motions. The laughter grew louder, blending with the groans of the carousel and the creak of the swings. I stumbled back, the rules flashing in my mind. Never approach the carousel. But the figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and disjointed, as though it were being pulled forward by invisible strings. The flashlight flickered, plunging me into darkness for a brief moment. When the light returned, the figure was gone, but the laughter was right behind me. I spun, my heart racing, and came face to face with the figure. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. The air around it grew colder, the metallic tongue in the air turning to a choking, acrid stench. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its voice layered with multiple tones, each more distorted than the last. I stumbled away, tripping over a loose patch of gravel. The figure didn't move, but the carousel spun faster, its groans turning into a deafening wail. The laughter followed me as I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. The path to the gate seemed impossibly far, the shadows closing in from all sides. The figure stepped closer, its movements faster now, more erratic. My chest tightened as I ran, the laughter echoing in my ears. I reached the gate and threw myself through it, slamming it shut behind me. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I turned back toward the park, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The carousel had stopped. The swings hung motionless. The figure was gone. But at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the carousel, I saw them. Small, childlike figures. Dozens of them, standing in the shadows, watching. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in my apartment made me flinch. The groan of the pipes, the creak of the floorboards. It all reminded me of the park, of the laughter that still echoed faintly in the corners of my mind. The rules ran through my head like a mantra, each word a reminder of how close I'd come to breaking them all. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was over. I had left the park. The gate had closed. Whatever was in that clearing had stayed behind. But as the hours passed, a nagging doubt crept into my mind. The figures, the small childlike shapes that had gathered at the edge of the carousel, weren't just watching me leave. They were waiting. By late afternoon, I couldn't ignore the signs. My apartment felt different, the air heavier. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, pooling in the corners of the room like oil. The faint sound of laughter teased my ears, distant and fleeting, but unmistakable. And then there was the mirror. It hung in the hallway, an old, simple thing I had barely noticed before. But now, every time I passed it, I felt its presence. I avoided looking into it, remembering the way the figure's hollow eyes had stared into mine. But late that night, as I walked past, something made me stop. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening as I faced the mirror. At first, I saw nothing but my own reflection, pale and haggard. But then, behind me, a shadow flickered, small, childlike. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection wasn't alone. A small figure stood behind me, its head tilted, its hollow eyes boring into mine. My breath caught as it raised one hand, pointing toward the door. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my keys and ran, not stopping until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. I drove without thinking, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The streets blurred past me, and all I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and the park, or whatever had followed me from it. Eventually, I stopped at a gas station on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I leaned against the car, trying to steady my breathing. The shadows seemed normal here, the air lighter. But as I stood there, I felt it again. That sensation of being watched. When I turned, the edge of the forest loomed in the distance. And there, just beyond the tree line, I saw them. Small, childlike figures, standing in the shadows, waiting. I've since moved, changed my number, even thrown out the mirror. But it doesn't matter. The laughter still finds me in the quiet moments, soft and mocking. Shadows flicker where they shouldn't, and sometimes I wake up to the sound of swings creaking in the distance. The rules weren't just for the park, they were for me. And now I know one final truth. Once you enter, you're never truly free. If you ever come across a park like this, with rusted swings and a carousel that feels too still, turn around. Leave. Do not read the rules. Do not go inside. Because once you do, they'll never stop watching.